Let's talk about wheelbase. What is it? How to properly measure it, and why it's important. Wheelbase is properly measured from the center point of the forward axle, the front axle, to the center point in between the drive axles. Back in the good old days, to the point up until the mid-60s or so, tractor trailer lengths, and we're talking in the US now, tractor trailer lengths were restricted to 55 feet overall, and that was the maximum length a tractor trailer could be. Well, we got into the late 60s, early 70s, and shippers began to pester the federal government because they wanted longer trailers. So they went from 35 feet to 40 feet, and they started growing the length of the trailers to keep the shippers happy. But the problem was, and the feds were smart enough to recognize this, was that the fact that the longer they made the trailer, the shorter they had to make the tractor to accommodate this 55 overall length. So the feds, actually caring about the life of a truck driver back then, decided, well, this wasn't really fair on the driver. And the trucking companies and the shippers and everybody wanted them to stay out on the road longer, but they were making the trucks smaller and smaller. So the feds, in their wisdom, somewhere around 1970, decided they were going to drop the overall length restriction, and this was allowed state by state too. Each state was allowed to pick their overall length, but gradually they allowed that it would only be the trailer length that they would measure after a certain point, and the tractors could get bigger and bigger and grow to whatever length the companies felt comfortable with and the drivers felt comfortable with. And there were some serious advantages to this because the roads were getting rough even back then. The feds didn't have the money to fix and repair the potholes in the infrastructure, so they decided a little longer wheelbase would allow for a better ride in the truck, and it would allow for a bigger bunk. That would keep the drivers happy, and it'd eliminate this problem of swing dip clearance, which was a problem they always had. Swing dip clearance is the distance between the truck and the trailer, so when you turn the tractor sharply, it won't hit the trailer. That's what the factories call swing dip clearance. So it solved that problem, and you stop seeing these crunched bunk extenders that many of you older guys will remember seeing. And there were other advantages too. It actually allowed, if you were pulling a reefer, for instance, it actually allowed more air to get at the reefer unit as compared to a tractor that was shoved right up against it, blocking the air. So it allowed the vehicles to stretch out, so no matter what trailer length you were pulling, the trailer length had to be legal for the time period, but the tractor length could be longer. And this is, you've got to remember too, this is in the days before air ride. So everything was spring ride, so the longer the wheelbase, the better it rode. Now there were a few disadvantages, but it wasn't that big a deal back then. Like the one disadvantage was it took a little more fuel. Back then, fuel was only 50 cents a gallon, so nobody really cared. They could afford the extra fuel. So by relaxing this overall length law, they allowed the trailers to get bigger, but yet the trucks remained more and more comfortable, and guys put bigger and bigger bunks on them depending on how long they wanted to stay out and that type of thing. And it was an advantage to us, the drivers I mean, when they dropped this overall length regulation. Now, as with everything, with an action there's always a reaction. So there were some advantages and disadvantages of allowing longer wheelbase when it came to practical application. One of the things that became evident was the longer the wheelbase, the heavier the truck. Now that was to be expected, but they got to the point where the more frame rail they put in, there became flex in the longer wheelbase trucks, and then they had to put in like a frame insert, another frame inside a frame to strengthen the frame to cut out that flex, but that added a lot of weight, so there was a disadvantage that way. there was a loss of maneuverability, as you could probably expect, but they were able to compensate with better steering cut on the big hood conventionals. But there was also the disadvantage of what we called high siding, and I'll show you how that worked with my little wooden truck here. Let me show you on my little wooden truck with this demonstration the problem of high siding, or teeter-tottering the truck. On a longer wheelbase truck, as it climbs out a sharp driveway or something like that onto the road, on a long wheelbase truck, a sharp point at the top of the driveway will hang up the truck on the fuel tanks. Now on a shorter wheelbase that wouldn't be happening, because these drives would be farther up here and it would lift the truck up as it hit the rise. But on a longer wheelbase truck, you can hang up on the fuel tanks, and that's one of the problems with the really long wheelbase trucks, and I've seen guys do that. On the bright side, when it came to scaling a longer wheelbase truck, the longer wheelbase tended to isolate the engine weight better than a tight wheelbase. So basically it was the steering axle alone supporting the majority of the weight of the motor, and that was better because then you were able to isolate the weight of the load on the drives and the trailer, and it became easier to scale that way. However, having said that, a lot of the scales, as the trucks grew longer, a lot of the scales, particularly the private scales at factories and stuff, didn't grow in length. So the cat scales did, but if you were scaling at a customer's, for instance, half the time now, you couldn't fit on the factory scales, you were too long, so you had to scale axle by axle to axle out the truck. So that was a bit of an annoyance. Of course, as with anything else, we got a little bit carried away when it came to stretching the wheelbase, and long wheelbase trucks became a bit of a fashion statement, frankly. And you go to the truck shows now and you'll see all sorts of trucks with a 300 plus wheelbase, and they look really cool. They don't get very much fuel mileage, but the problem with these things is they get to the point where they've lost their maneuverability. They're so long. So there's kind of an ideal spec for every truck, depending on how you're going to use it, what you're doing, what kind of trailers. If you're pulling a flatbed, for instance, and you're a long wheelbase, you can actually overhang the load on the front of the trailer so you're not over length. And there's an advantage right there. But it seems now that most of the mega carriers, if you look at the mega carriers who run drop nose trucks or curb sniffers, it seems the ideal wheelbase for that type of application with a 53-foot van is somewhere between 220 inches and 235 inches. In a long hood conventional, like I run, most guys now run 260 to 280 inch wheelbase. Mine's a 280, and I found that a very nice length to work with and scale, and yet never had trouble with the maneuverability of it. And they ended up going to a 280 wheelbase. Actually, Kenworth did. When they brought out the Studio Sleeper, they found that they needed a 280 inch wheelbase to accommodate the size of the bunk. And now you get these guys too also for, you look at carriers like Reliable, where those guys literally live in the trucks. So all of those guys need to run over a 300 inch wheelbase just to accommodate the 110, 120, 130 inch bunks that those guys have. Because sometimes those guys don't head home for months at a time. So they've got to have literally a little house behind them, and it's very handy for those guys. But there again, it adds to the weight of the truck. So some of those guys at Reliable, for instance, the tractor alone can weigh 30,000 pounds. So that, of course, takes away from your load in the trailer. Now, car loads aren't particularly heavy, but you couldn't use that same wheelbase application, big bunk on a guy that hauled steel or lumber, for instance. You'd just be too heavy. If you're the one speccing the truck, it's very important to spec the proper length for the application for what you're going to use the truck for. If you're just going to show the truck at Kentucky or Dallas, it can be whatever length you want. If you're going to work the truck though, generally most working tractors, the longest they get with a long hood is around 280, 290, and you haven't lost a whole lot of maneuverability there. If you're speccing a drop nose truck, you're looking at about 235 inch wheelbase max. And you've got to allow yourself room, of course, to slide the fifth wheel backward and forward. and you've got to watch that swing dip clearance as you pull your trailer in closer to the bunk. But it's all a balancing act. Now, having said that, I've known many cases where guys spec'd a really long wheelbase truck because it looked cool as hell, and then found out they couldn't work the truck because it was just too long to get into a lot of these places they had to go, and ended up having to chop the frame of the truck to the tune of $6,000 or $8,000. That's a pretty expensive mistake to make, but it was pretty common. So you see these guys with these really long wheelbase trucks, if they're getting around and working those trucks, it means they're one hell of a driver. Not your average guy can maneuver one of these things around and work it successfully. And that brings me to my story for today. I know a few guys that have done that with these big wheelbase trucks. Let me tell you a story about one of them. Now, I've known a few guys with wheelbase trucks over 300 inches. The Lettuce Kings had more than a few. Chinaman's had a couple. But the guy I want to talk about today is a friend of mine named Richard. Now, when he spec'd this truck back in 1999, when he was ordering it from Pete, he spec'd a wheelbase of 312 inches. And when it came in, I looked at the truck pinned up to his reefer and I went, wow, that's really long. But if anybody can maneuver a truck that long, it's Richard, because he's one of the finest drivers I've ever seen in action anyway. So I knew he'd be all right. I knew he could manage it. So he was telling me a story one time. He came in to a Pilot fuel stop, and the Pilot fuel stop was at exit 104 off I-94 in Michigan. I don't know if you guys would know that area or not, some of you would, but it was across from what we used to call the old Tekai truck stop. And you go in the second driveway, go through the fuel pumps, and go at the first. So Richard had arced in the far driveway and arced in towards the fuel pumps, but he wanted to park. There was only one spot open, and it was such a small truck stop, a small Pilot. There was only one spot open, and he decided he was going to jackknife in and back in. So he set himself up. Everybody in the truck stop could see what he was going to attempt to do, and Richard said he could hear the conversation on the radio, guys betting whether or not he could hit that spot. And he was so long, the guys are all betting against him that he'll never hit that spot. But Richard's a fine hand at the wheel, and he stuffed it in there in one shot. And I knew that truck stop, and I knew how it was set up, and he described to me where he had backed in. And I said, man, that's a hell of a job, considering the spot you went for, and I know where you're talking about. And he kind of laughed and said, the secret is, and he was blindsiding into that spot. Very tricky maneuver. He kind of laughed. He said, all I do, the truck is so long that I just look backwards through the back window of the Pete, the little window in the bunk. He says, and back it up just like a car. When he's jackknifing it, he could see the whole time looking backwards out through the back window until he got to the point where the trailer was where he wanted it, lined up with the hole. Then he just used the mirrors to set the tractor straight with the trailer and stuff it in the hole. But all of these guys didn't know that he could actually look out the back window and guide it into the hole. I didn't even think of that myself. Mine's not long enough that I could do that with, but he sure impressed everybody in the truck stop. I got a real laugh out of it, and it was just a little trick he hadn't bothered to explain to anybody. So I thought that was a cool story. So in today's video, you've learned a little bit about the history of wheelbase, why it's important. If you're speccing a truck for yourself, if you're going to be an owner-operator, the wheelbase is highly important in the spec that you build. I hope you guys have learned from this. Take care, keep the rubber side down. I'll see you on the back haul.